Hello, I'm Pastor Jane Ellingwood, the Interim Associate Minister at the First Congregational Church of Ridgefield in Connecticut. My message for this Sunday, August 23rd, is based on Exodus chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 2, verse 10. This is the story of the birth of Moses when the ancient people of Israel were living in Egypt. The descendants of Abraham and Sarah through their grandson Jacob had settled in Egypt during a famine. They had been saved at that time by Jacob's youngest son Joseph, who had become the head of Pharaoh's household and second only to Pharaoh over the land of Egypt. But now Joseph had been dead for quite some time, and things were changing. Let us hear this sacred story from the book of Exodus. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her attendants walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrews' children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." Here ends the reading. What can we do? How can we help? Do we have a niche or a role to play? And how does God try to work through us? These are questions that some of us have been discussing recently at our church and in small discussion groups as we have been thinking about what we can do to respond to really overwhelming problems in our world today, responding to racism, to injustice and other inequalities, to the COVID-19 pandemic, and to many other things in the economy and in our society that are very troubling and sometimes seem almost too much to handle. Some of these problems are in fact systemic, and they're enmeshed with each other, And they can be very difficult for us to figure out, how is it that we could find a way in? How is it that we somehow could find a thread and we could hold on to the thread and pull it and it would bring us in and we would see some of the work to do, even though things are so complicated and intersected. Other problems like the pandemic that we're still experiencing or the climate crisis affect people from many walks of life, including us. Some people do suffer more than others due to the inequities and the discrimination and also their own vulnerabilities and health situations, but no one is immune, and all of us are affected by those major things that cover the world. So again, how do we discern where we fit in the story of trying to change things or trying to make things better, not only for us, but for other people and for the entire world? Well, I think that the women and the girls in the story of the baby Moses that we just heard offer us some very courageous and some creative examples of what we can do. And we can do these while being ourselves and playing our own roles. And this was true in the story, even for people who did not hold much power in the eyes of the world that they lived in. The Pharaoh's daughter was privileged, and she did have more power than the other women and girls in the story, but she too was still a woman, and they were all living in a patriarchal culture and society. This is probably why the Pharaoh misjudged the women and the girls. I love what Austin Channing Brown says in her sermon on this same story. She talks about the many fears that the Pharaoh had of the Israelite people. Those were all covered in detail in the Bible reading that we just had. And the main one, he was afraid that they were thriving, they were multiplying, they were growing in numbers ever since the time long ago that their ancestors had migrated to Egypt. But Brown said that the Pharaoh made a mistake in fearing the men and the boys. He should have feared the women and the girls. They were the ones, she said, who were thwarting everything that the Pharaoh wanted to do in his evil plans. The Pharaoh, as we heard, let the Hebrew daughters live, the girls were to live, while he commanded the people to kill the sons. But not only did some of the Hebrew women disobey the Pharaoh, it turns out his own daughter disobeyed him too. In our world, we might call this civil disobedience, and Terence Fretheim, one of the really renowned Old Testament scholars, also calls it in this case defenseless resistance. I like the nuance he puts on that, because other than the Pharaoh's daughter, the women and girls would have had no physical defenses against the Pharaoh if they had been caught. They could have been caught telling him something that wasn't true, as the midwives did, or simply caught helping the baby Moses to live after he had been put into the river in the basket. The Pharaoh could have ordered any one of them, including his own daughter, to be killed because they disobeyed him. And each one of them put her own life and the life of the others they worked with, because they all worked together. They did not work solo. They put their lives on the line to save the lives of the Hebrew boys. These women and girls were resourceful, even if they may not have been physically powerful. And again, they stayed within their own roles and their own niches as they stood against letting those baby boys die or letting them be killed. So, taking them all, we'll see which roles that they played. But the midwives, at the beginning part of the story, when they were told that they were supposed to actually do the killing, it wasn't just letting them die, but they were supposed to kill the boys. They used their knowledge of childbirth to craft the false story that they told to the Pharaoh. They also let the boys live because they feared God more than they feared the Pharaoh. They knew that life was precious to God and life was not to be taken away. Moses' sister used her own ingenuity to watch the basket as it floated down the Nile. She also was very brave. Austin Channing Brown points out that when she asked the Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" she was essentially suggesting to the Pharaoh's daughter that they commit civil disobedience and break the law together. And this was really a huge risk for a slave to take. And then there's Moses' mother. She was creative too in her own way. When she took a basket and prepared to cradle Moses while he was going down the Nile River, she was actually making sort of a mini ark for him to protect him. It turns out in the Hebrew language, the words basket and ark, as in Noah's Ark, evidently come from the same root. And so the author was making this point too. And the mother showed love for her baby and later for Moses as he had grown up, unfortunately enough that she had to give him to the Pharaoh's daughter. She still showed him love. And I think this was a sacrificial love and a very unselfish love. She wanted him to live. The Pharaoh's daughter showed her own compassion and mercy, and also a sense of fairness and justice when she looked on that baby who was crying in the basket when she found him. And she looked at him with eyes of pity and eyes that recognized that he must be one of the Hebrew boys. She gave the baby a second chance to live, and even, without knowing it, a chance to be nursed by his own mother. And then she gave him a home in the palace, and she treated him as her own son. She used not only her privileged position, but also her own caring and her own resourcefulness. All of these women and girls did what they could to give new beginnings or second chances to Moses and also to some of the other Israelite boys who were saved because the midwives refused to kill them. And it was indeed a very, very dark time. Well, that's the end of the story of the baby Moses. Right after that story ends in chapter 2 of Exodus, we already hear of Moses as a man. Perhaps we'll remember that he killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. It was someone who was a kinfolk to Moses from his original birth. So Moses had to flee from Egypt and from the Pharaoh. He ended up settling in Midian, where he was taken in by the priest of Midian, and he married one of the priest's daughters, Zipporah. I mentioned this last week, and in doing so, I said that the name Midian for a town and a place is thought to be named after one of the 6 sons of Abraham and his wife Keturah, whom Abraham married after his wife Sarah had died. And then at the end of chapter 2 in Exodus, it says, and I'll have to read this to you, after a long time the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. Like God did with Noah and his family, and with the birds and the animals that were on the ark. And like God did with Hagar and her son Ishmael, who was Abraham's firstborn son, when they were dying of thirst in the wilderness, God heard the cries of the Israelites. God remembered his promises, and God saw them. God never forgets, but when God does remember, which is only an expression, God acts with compassion and justice on behalf of God's people and God's creation. This is the beginning of the story in the book of Exodus of God giving the Israelite people who were living in slavery in Egypt new beginnings and many new chances at life as God's people. May we give thanks every day to the God of steadfast love and faithfulness, who also is faithful to us. Amen.